struggles as we were 100 years ago. And women are at the center of the struggle against, unfortunately, the outrageous FBI and Justice Department attacks on anti-war and international solidarity activists and organizations, including Freedom Road. So let me just spend a couple minutes telling you about Freedom Road. For most of you know, but some don't. Freedom Road is a revolutionary socialist and Marxist-Leninist organization in the United States. FRIZO organizes to make revolution, to turn this system upside down and put the working class in power. Our strategy for revolution in the U.S. is to build the strategic alliance between the multinational working class and the oppressed nationalities. Or another way of saying it is to unite workers of all colors, employed and unemployed, with the willing of all classes of oppressed nationalities. That is African Americans, Chicanos, Indigenous Americans, Asian Americans. This will be done under the leadership of the working class and its party. We are opposed to exploitation, discrimination, and oppression. We hold that the rich class of people who run the economy and government of this country are unfit to rule. That's right. We support all movements that challenge their power and privilege. We want to replace capitalism with socialism, the rule of the working class. We want what the current system cannot offer: equality, peace, and justice.
All right. Yeah. And as Sarah said, we're here to celebrate International Women's Day. And I'd like to give you a brief history of International Women's Day. In 1908, women mainly from the garment industry came together in New York City's Rutgers Square to demand a strong union in the needles trade and the right to vote. In 1910, German revolutionary Clara Zetkin, having heard of the powerful protests in New York, proposed that March 8th be celebrated as International Women's Day. Today it's a holiday celebrated by millions of working people to honor women who stand up and fight for their rights and the rights of others around the world. And one of the first speakers that we're going to be listening to, Jess Sonnen, is just one of those women who stand up for their rights. And also I'd like to take note of Jenny Eisert, who is another working woman who is standing up for her rights. And they both celebrate their birthday today. So let's give them a round of applause. Happy birthday. That's all right. Happy birthday, dear Jess and Jenny. Happy birthday to you. All right. All right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hopefully everyone will have a piece, yeah?
I'll cut it into very small pieces.
Okay.
Oh, perfect.
Big pieces.
All right. Okay, I'd just like to give you a little brief rundown of Jess Sonnen, if you don't know who she is. She's a leader in the Anti-War Committee and Freedom Road Socialist Organization. And she's one of the ones who had her house raided this past September by the FBI because of her work with international solidarity activists around the world and the Anti-War Committee. And she has refused to testify before the grand jury. So let's give her a round of applause for that. And here she is.
Thank you. I know a couple people are just getting here, and everybody hates to go to the front of the room when they arrive, but we do have 4 empty seats up front if anybody wants to sit up front by us. I brushed my teeth right before, so it should be safe. So Sarah and Angela already told you a lot about the day, International Women's Day, which is our birthday. And it's amazing to me that 100 years ago, this day was founded. And I think one of the things I like to do on International Women's Day is remember some of our heroes who are women. Women who were communists, working class leaders, fighters for national liberation, and against oppression. Already mentioned was Clara Zetkin, the German revolutionary who first called for there to be an International Women's Day. Nadja Krupskaya, Alexandra Kollontai, Lucy Parsons, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Emma Goldman, Louise Bryant, Anna Louise Strong, Leila Khalid, Maria Serrano, Comandante Ramona, Asada Shakur, Yuri Kochiyama, and many more. Any that I missed? I'm sure there are many. Any that you know that you want to name today that I missed? We got named already, girl. I wanted to name some of these people because these are all folks that I never heard of when I was growing up. Not any of them. But they are amazing women who made amazing contributions to their communities and to the world. And we should all know their names, and we should all know their stories, and the stories of many others like them. But the stories of working class and oppressed people are often left out of the history books. And even when we make it into history books, the women are still left in the shadows, so we don't get to learn their names or their faces or their stories. But their stories are a part of our history, and as we celebrate International Women's Day, we must remember all that they have won, while we still recognize that we have a lot yet to do, right? There's a long ways to go before we have equality for women, before we have justice for working people and freedom for the oppressed. But International Women's Day is our day. It's a working class holiday that serves to recognize the important contributions of women like them and like us to the struggles of our peoples. And it's a day to continue to fight for economic and political equality for women. And even though it's celebrated in every corner of the globe today, it's not recognized here in the United States. There's countries where it's a national holiday. You don't even go to work on Women's Day, as it should be. But not here. Here in the United States, which is where the struggle that inspired Women's Day happened, it's not known. And so one of the reasons we have this celebration every year is to bring back our history to the people in our movements, and so that people understand where we come from. And it's an honor for me to share not only my birthday, but this important holiday with each of you. So in addition to acknowledging all that we've won and all that we benefit from the struggles of these women that have come before us, I feel like we need to, on International Women's Day, start by recognizing the real conditions that women are facing today, which are not that good. It may be the best time it's ever been to be a woman in terms of your rights, your equality, and your economic standing in the world, but it's still nowhere close to equal. It's not fair, and it's not good. I like to learn some new facts every year for Women's Day about our status in the world. Women perform 2/3 of the world's work. We produce half of the world's food, but we earn just 10% of the income, and we own just 1% of the property. On a global scale, this is a huge imbalance, a huge injustice, a huge inequality. But it's not just global. Here in the United States, it was almost 50 years ago that the Equal Pay Act was signed, which was supposed to make it equal in terms of our income, men and women. But it hasn't worked. And on average, to this day, after 50 years of equal pay being the law of the land, white women are making something like 77 cents on the dollar compared to what men in the same line of work are making. And oppressed women of color, are making even less. Sometimes it's like half, it's like double the difference. The wage gap is huge. And the gap in income means that our lives are unequal too. The ability to buy food, our housing, our access to health care and education, it's not equal. There's how much, it's kind of like hard to think about what 77 cents on the dollar add up to. Well, it adds up for 8 months of groceries for a family of 4. If women were paid equal to men, that's how much groceries we could buy with the income difference. 8 months of groceries for a family of 4. So it's a real impact on our basic necessities of life that this wage gap has. Our women's rights to control our own bodies continue to be under threat. From the attacks on reproductive freedom in the state houses and the federal capitol buildings and the courts, to the collapse of the social safety net that has provided public assistance for women who choose to do the work of raising children. Lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women experience discrimination in terms of health care, housing, employment, marriage rights for those who want those, and many other areas. And violence against women continues on a massive scale. 1 in 3 women globally will be raped, beaten, coerced into sex, or otherwise abused in her lifetime. 1 in 3. The rate of imprisonment of women has gone up dramatically here in the U.S. thanks to the war on drugs. And when I say dramatically, I'm talking like 7 times the number of women are imprisoned today. And almost all of that increase is due to minor drug offenses. Women are being imprisoned in the war on drugs. And it's not to say that many men aren't too, but oftentimes their boyfriends get away. And it's the women that do the time. The fact is that these women are working class women and largely from oppressed peoples. Our situation is not equal. It's not fair. We have a raw deal under capitalism, not only in the United States but around the world. And that's it's the situation not only of women but of our whole class and of oppressed nations that brings the world to cry out for justice and for change. And the people in Wisconsin are at the forefront of the U.S. working class struggle. It's the school teachers that Glenn Beck hates so much. Most of them are women. Not all teachers are women, but most of them are. And they're leading the way for us. And in Egypt, in Cairo, and throughout the Middle East, women are a key part of those struggles to throw out dictators that have been backed by U.S. imperialism for so long. Women play a decisive part in all of these struggles, just as we play a leading role in our own organizations and our movements right here in the Twin Cities. But as our topic tonight suggests, we don't get a free pass. And the fight for liberation is often answered with the heavy boot of repression. And I wanted to go back and talk I've been learning a little bit more about this Clara Zetkin, the German revolutionary who started Women's Day. She was an amazing woman. She was, when she was young, she was exiled from Germany under anti-socialist laws in around 1878 or so. It was about 50 years later that I'm fast forwarding quite a bit for you. She was 75 years old. She was in the last year of her life. And even then, she was at the forefront of the fight against fascism. Now, I know a lot of healthy, active women in their 70s, but back in the 1930s, that was a bit long in the tooth. And Clara, I'm just saying, she was the oldest person serving in the parliament in Germany. And as such, she was entitled to call the session of parliament to order in 1932. And when she did, in the last speech of her life, she called for people to unite to fight against Nazi fascism. She said, "The order of the hour is the unified front of all workers in order to force back fascism so that the enslaved and exploited retain the force of power of their organizations and even their physical lives. All those threatened, all those suffering, all those who thirst for liberty belong in the unified front against fascism and its representatives in government." Her words ring true today, but just again, that was 1932. About less than a year later, is when Hitler took power in Germany, and that parliament was dissolved of its power, and Nazism took over and ravaged Europe, killing countless people. It was a brutal system. But she was standing up there just months before her own death, calling on people to take a stand and to unite to fight against it. And her words, when I read them, rang very true for me today. It's a bit of a different scale, but it makes me think about my own life. Tracy's going to talk later about our case of the 23 anti-war and international solidarity activists who've been targeted by the FBI and the grand jury over in Chicago. But we've really been working very much in the spirit of Clara Zetkin to build a broad front to push back against this attack in defense of our movements, in defense of our organizations, and in defense of the targeted individuals. In Clara's words, all those who thirst for liberty should stand with us, and they do. The 23 of us who are being dragged through this legal witch hunt will also follow Clara's example. We will not surrender. We will not stop fighting. It will be to our dying breaths that we're going to be doing the work that we've been doing. We're not going to testify to that grand jury. We're not going to turn traitors against the movements and the organizations that we've helped to build. Most of us are women, mothers like Clara. Actually, she was known at that time as Grandmother Zetkin. Sarah's the only one of us that has the distinguished mint of being a grandmother. Sorry, a little trouble with the right word. You guys think, fill in the blank for me there. But no, really, most of us are women, and many of us are mothers. And, you know, like Clara, we're putting a lot in the line to take this stand. But we don't have a choice. There's nothing else that we could do. Nothing else in principle that we could never take any other principled stand. And just like Grandmother Zetkin, when she made that speech in 1932, we won't be swayed either. I know that you're all here already, but I got to say, it means so much to us to have you join us as we continue to stand up against repression. The other speakers today, Sarah and Lutza and Tracy, are women who I respect greatly and who've also stood strong in the face of repression. We have much to learn from each other as we all make our contributions to the history of liberation. Long live International Women's Day.
Gillian Gibbons is, of course, of the RNC 8, and she was unjustly charged with felonies for protests at the Republican National Convention in 2008. She was at the heart of the struggle until the government's case all but fell apart. They blinked. Now she continues to be available to the Committee to Stop FBI Repression and the 23 of us who have been subpoenaed. Lutza.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody that's, I don't know who initiated this, but has organized the panel, and happy birthday Jenny, and happy International Women's Day. Most of you know who I am, and as Sarah said, I was one of the RNC 8. We were 8 people charged with conspiracy and terrorism after the 2008 RNC in St. Paul. And this is a little bit of a sidetrack to begin with, but it's interesting for me watching this case unfold because my case, as I think many cases like political repression in this country, really involved a lot of men. And it was a very different dynamic. And, you know, we had a legal team, and this may also be true for you all, but our legal team was also majority men. And it really did inform the dynamic in a lot of ways of what was focused on, and, you know, just the division of labor and everything in our case and in our support certainly reflected the, you know, very real elements of patriarchy that we still live with today. And I think it's really notable that both during the RNC in 2008 and then afterwards in the support of our case, most of the people who did most of the work in supporting us were women, though, you know, the kind of focal point of the state from on the outside looked to be mostly men. So I guess want to name those dynamics to start out with. But moving on from that, I should say that I operate on the premise that, you know, we cannot both fight for radical change in a way that's meaningful and effective and ensure that none of us will ever face state repression. And this really gets to the truth of what we're fighting for, and I think Jess did a really good job of outlining some of the many issues that we all in this room care about. But, you know, the reality is that if we lived in a system that didn't repress people for seeking justice and liberation, we wouldn't have a reason to be fighting this system in the first place. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important to steer the dialogue away from this kind of pondering of how do we, you know, how best to avoid state repression, and instead to talk more about how we foster communities of resistance in that context. And this is a point that I've been talking about for years, and probably lots of people in this room have heard me give a very similar talk from time to time, so apologies if I'm just repeating myself. But I think nothing really drove that point home for me as much as the events that unfolded this fall. And, you know, this fall for me was supposed to be the time that I went to trial. And fortunately, for me personally, what happened instead was that my charges were dropped, and the charges for 2 of my co-defendants were dropped as well. At the same time, 5 other of our co-defendants ultimately pled out to a single gross misdemeanor apiece. And another thing that was going on for us in the fall was that a good friend of ours was facing his own political battle in a court in Iowa. And so in September, over the course of a single week, he ultimately decided, rather than going to trial, to plead to a lesser included charge. My charges were dropped. It fundamentally transformed the case that we were looking at as the RNC8. And then a week after that, the raids happened on people's houses here, and subpoenas were given out across the country in a case that's related in some ways, but really is its own separate thing. And, there was a moment before those raids happened where I started to think, like, wow, this could be over in a few, like this fall, it could end and we could move on to other things. And that was only a couple days. And then the raids happened. And it just really, for me, it was a really intense time, even though I was no longer the focal point of state repression. It really drove home the point that repression and state pushback are amongst the material conditions that we work in and that we live in and that we struggle in, and those are things that we can't ignore ever, whether or not at any given moment any of us is the person actually being targeted. And I think it's really interesting to talk about nurturing resistance on International Women's Day and to talk about that on a panel of all women. Bell Hooks once said, "In a culture of domination, preoccupation with victimage is inevitable." And I think that's something for us to reflect on today, the idea that one of the roles that we all, but women especially, are afforded in this system is that of victim. And until we build a different culture, a culture of resistance and not of victimage, as she calls it, we're stuck in the box that the state has put us in. And so one of our first acts of resistance in dealing with state repression should be to shift that framework, so that while we are targets and while people here are actively being targeted by the state, our primary identity isn't as targets or as victims. And, I say that I don't want to underplay the profound injustice that's being meted out against people. I mean, this is a very serious thing that's going on, and I think most people here know that it probably will get more serious as time progresses. But I want to suggest that the way forward involves taking a circumstance that nobody would have chosen in their right minds at any rate, but seeing the opportunity that's inherent in it. And there really is opportunity here. I think, for one, the opportunity is to use a platform that has appeared, and to take the case at hand, and this grand jury in Chicago, the subpoenas, and then whatever comes next, and to connect that to other political cases across the country and throughout the world, and also to connect that to routine cases that really comprise the majority of what goes through the criminal justice system. And I know that I've heard many of you speak about this case a lot and talk about the wholesale criminalization and defamation of entire communities, Muslim communities, Arab communities, based entirely on, ethnic and religious status. And I think it's important to recognize that this case is a test case for a recent Supreme Court ruling. People know about that, Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. And one of the best possible outcomes, I think, of this case is that we take something that's intended as an attack on this movement and make that the foundation of a new era of solidarity and struggle amongst different communities and bridging those gaps that we maybe haven't done the best job of bridging in the past. And then, the other way that this is an opportunity is really in finding things to celebrate in our own resistance. And that can sound like cold comfort, like to celebrate the fact that we have to resist at all. But I think that it's significant and it's real, and that's the way that we build a movement that has some potential to succeed in the future. The almost 24 people that have been subpoenaed have refused to cooperate. They've done the right thing and they've done the courageous thing, and they've done something really difficult, and that's something for all of us to celebrate and be proud of. And that's really a choice that people affirm every day for themselves. Anybody who's been subpoenaed could change their minds and go and testify from one day to the next. And so it's important to remember that these weren't just static decisions made and now they're over with, but all 23 people are continuing to affirm that belief and that commitment every day that this continues. And it's just, it's something to celebrate that people have made a decision not to go in for this idea of individual gain or even just individual protection at the expense of the collective good. and we're all better for it, you know, and our movements are stronger for that. And that is exactly what a community of resistance is. It's one that actually thrives through its acts of defiance in the face of oppression, rather than falling apart as the going gets tough. And I guess, yeah, want to end by saying that I think this idea of a community of resistance is really what we need to be focusing on building as this case continues, and really after this case ends, because there will always be another case.
And our next speaker is Sarah Olson, longtime Twin Cities resident. She spent 7 years in prison in California, in probably one of the worst prison systems, after being underground since the 70s, when she was involved with the Symbionese Revolutionary Army. During that time that she was underground, she lived in Zimbabwe at the beginning of the 80s with her husband, who was posted there with Oxfam, the English Oxfam. She was a long-time anti-apartheid activist, and that of course was a successful struggle for the Committee for the Liberation of South Africa. Now, Sarah has stood up to her repression with great courage in a very principled way. While in prison, she wrote about the conditions in the prison for many publications, and maintained and shared her deeply informed, astute analysis of local, U.S., and world affairs. Since she has been home, she has very generously and willingly shared her experience and wisdom in events like this. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. And happy International Women's Day. And I participated in many such commemorations since the 1970s, as I'm sure many women and men in this room have, and I'm really happy to be doing so again. But I'm not so happy about the particular events that we're noting tonight. While there are always instances of repression and suppression and oppression to mark, it's always more than unfortunate when people are facing real jail time for anything, but particularly when it's for a principled stand. And then, as we all know, it's not for something that is really illegal, except that now it is. The Obama administration argued the case in the person of Elena Kagan, the newest Supreme Court Justice Holder versus the Humanitarian Law Project, and the decision came last June. The project was advising the Turkish PKK, a Kurdish separatist organization, and the Light, the Liberation Tigers for Tamil Elam, advising them legally how to present their cases before the UN and the like, and advising them, ironically, to move toward nonviolence. The decision severely impedes freedom of speech, perhaps just outright attacks it, making any material support of any organization on the terrorist watch list, including speech, illegal. And the terrorist watch list is government engendered with no public supervision. The current administration, whoever the current administration is, makes the decisions of whom and what goes on it. And maybe some of you heard Noam Chomsky talking about in the 1980s how Saddam Hussein and Iraq were on the terrorist watch list, and the Reagan administration wanted to give aid to Saddam Hussein, so they removed Iraq and replaced Iraq with Cuba, which of course has been the subject of terrorist attacks for several decades. When the raids first happened here last fall, there was no public knowledge of exactly why they occurred, at least when I first heard about them, and especially about the government infiltrator, Karen Sullivan. In fact, I heard about her from Sarah Martin. My friend Claude Marks was visiting from San Francisco to show his film here from the Freedom Archives called COINTELPRO 101, and he said, "I'll bet this is about support for the Palestinians." Because after all, the attack on Gaza in 2008 and the attacks on aid boats approaching Gaza from the sea, all of which killed many, many people, over thousands, hundreds, and then over 1,000, has not been good PR for Israel. And probably true, I thought, but the Obama administration's support for war and the anti-war stances of a lot of the people involved in this organization and other organizations could be the reasons. The result, though, is that people we know could go to jail for the term of the federal grand jury in Chicago for refusing to testify under a grant of immunity. My friend Sarah Martin and I recently talked about withstanding conditions in jail if she ends up there. I hated jail so much that while awaiting prosecution in Sacramento County Jail, where at the time already 8 people had successfully committed suicide that year with plastic bag suffocation and hurling themselves off balconies 3 stories high onto concrete floors, I petitioned the court to send me to prison since I'd already taken a plea in Los Angeles. The DA, as DAs will, barked against the transfer, and the judge thankfully growled, "She's not going to Europe." And he sent me on my way. As my friends from CCWF, which is Central California Women's Facility, write me today in letters, conditions are getting worse, and I mean worse, daily in California's financially strapped system, or golden gulag, as Ruthie Gilmore so aptly terms it in the title of her book about that prison system. But prison is still better than jail. All I could say to Sarah is that one must conduct oneself with dignity and learn not to flinch when told to strip and to stand there while cops scream at you. The naked thing is an integral part of prison and also jail. Guards love to make prisoners take their clothes off. Security. One guard ordered me to squat and cough 15 times while I stood naked in a circle of other naked women prisoners in receiving and release at Valley State Prison for Women when I was transferred to CCWF, which is across the road from VSPW. Why? I don't know, because she could. They try to make you lose it, and all I can advise is don't. I once asked for advice on how to do time from a wise long-termer. Actually, she was an LWOPer, which means life without possibility of parole. And I said, I know, 1 day at a time. And she said, no. Some days it's 1 hour at a time. Now, Sarah will be released. I knew, too, that I would get out of prison. And it's important to know that because it's hope. Many women I left behind in prison will not get out, ever. California, which is a state-run system, not private, and although many new Republican governors want to privatize prisons in their state to save money or enhance the already flourishing private law enforcement-related industrial complex, state systems are not private, and neither is the federal system. The United States government and all 50 states imprison 2.9 million people, with over 8 million in varying levels of custody from parole, probation to SHUs, security housing units, which are really where the U.S. military got its precursors for torture. The U.S. tortures in its prisons, often outright, but predominantly through isolation units, and has done so to hundreds of prisoners, particularly with the rise of isolation wings and units in the last 2 decades. Advisors to the military at Abu Ghraib were former wardens and assistant wardens from U.S. prisons, and some of them had already been fired in the U.S. for inhumane conduct. Just as apparently terrible conditions and secret trials will continue at Guantanamo under Obama, the same will continue, as they have for years, to countless prisoners. And believe me, in-prison hearings are as illegal as anything can be. In state and federal systems in the United States, California has a women's SHU at Valley State Prison for Women, which is across the road from CCWF, the 2 prisons together marking the largest complex of women prisoners in any one place in the entire world. Mostly one goes to the SHU for rule breaking, often very bald-faced rule breaking. I knew one woman who got a year in the SHU for jumping an interior perimeter fence. She couldn't jump the outer perimeter fence because it's electrified. 23-hour-a-day lockdown, showers twice a week, with handcuffs on and guards watching, maybe an hour a day exercise and an asphalt-covered dog run. Every prison has a jail that's basically the same, except the buildings are less imposing than shoes. So you see, when these are common conditions in prisons for ordinary people, who are mostly in prison for drugs and mostly for the drug of marijuana, it's not so strange that our government would haul someone before a grand jury for advocating solutions to a foreign policy, Palestine, Israel, war in the Middle East, that challenges official actions. If they can mistreat and even torture portions of the population who have little or no experience with self-advocacy, and do so in staggeringly high numbers in relation to prison populations in the rest of the world, well, sooner or later, they get around to you. And that's why we organize, we march, and we fight in whatever manner we can. Because we don't want what happens every day to those of us who are less fortunate to happen to our community, our friends, our loved ones, or to us. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Tracy Malm. She is an organizer with the Students for a Democratic Society at the U of M. She was also one of the activists whose was raided. She too has refused to be intimidated.
So my talk is mostly going to be on what happened and where we're going from here. I see some new faces, so maybe, you know, for a lot of people this will be a rerun, but maybe you'll learn something new. I think a lot of people know on September 24th, 2010 is when we had 5 homes and the Office of the Anti-War Committee raided in Minneapolis. There were 2 homes in Chicago that were also raided. It was a coordinated effort. There were over 50 agents involved in raiding our homes. My apartment was one of those raided. I live in an apartment complex. I came at 7 a.m., which is not my favorite time. We were pulled out of our rooms. I mean, we had to be escorted to the bathroom in our own apartment. I pay a ridiculous amount of money to rent, and I can't even go to the bathroom alone. You know, they took away our phones for a lot of us. They took away computer access, basically isolating us. Not basically, actually isolating us. I had to fight for my ability to call a lawyer. I had to fight for my ability to call my boss, who's sitting in front of me. Like, you know, these kind of basic things. They wouldn't tell us what was going on. What they told me was this is, you know, they're investigating us about material, or investigating me at the time, it was me, about in regards to material support for foreign terrorist organizations. And it was related to a trip I took in 2004. Now keep in mind, this raid happens in 2010. That's 4 years, that's 6 years later, right? And you know what, I'm going to do a little tangent here. Like my trip, you know, on Women's Day reminds me a lot of this. My trip was hosted, one of the groups that hosted my trip was the Women's Committees in Palestine. They're centered in the West Bank, and they are an amazing organization, actually. They do things that a lot of people go after the Middle East for being a very sexist region, that it's all centered around men. But in fact, the Women's Committees is a shining light that's happening in Palestine right now. The work that they do is as basic as providing computer classes for women. Computer training in an area where it's hard to get electricity because of the occupation. They put together kindergartens so that children have places to go, and that so their mothers have a place or a time that they can be without their children. That they can just do the things that they need to do, whether it's just be alone and hang out, or whether it's doing all types of, you know, whatever they want. They organize exercise classes to provide a community for women to be together. The work that they do is something that shouldn't be criminalized, that I refuse to feel guilty about. In fact, I will continue at every opportunity to talk about the great and amazing work that they do. And I think it's very notable that, you know, on Women's Day we're You know, this is one of the groups that they're criminalizing. That they're going after a group that is trying to better the situation for women in the West Bank, in an occupied area that's occupied because of our tax dollars. At the time, so these raids happened on the 24th, I'll go back. There were 14 subpoenas between Minneapolis, Chicago, and Michigan. We had dates that were as close as 11 days later. So can you imagine your home gets raided on a Friday and within 11 days you're supposed to show up in Chicago to a grand jury? A lot of us hadn't, you know, you've heard of what a grand jury is, like Law and Order. Sometimes they do a grand jury. Nothing like Law and Order. Basically, you're put in a room without your lawyer, without an objective judge, just with a prosecutor, in front of a jury that is handpicked by the prosecutor. You have no idea who has said what in previous trials because everything is absolutely secret. You can't have your lawyer with you, so you have no idea what's going on. And for us, we had no idea even what they were exactly trying to charge us with. Who they were going after. 14 people with no idea, with no actual charges against any one of us. The idea was intimidation, without a doubt. And grand juries, I think, very reasonably are for the most part, seen as illegal in this country. Most states have grand juries on the books, but don't use them. Because they're, I mean, in what world is that democracy? That you have no right to a judge, you have no right to your own lawyer with you. It doesn't make any sense. You know, it was pretty obvious from that first day when we had our houses raided that it was about who we knew and the work that we do. I mean, it was absolutely obvious. Most of the things that they took were notebooks. The vast majority of the things that they took from our homes were notebooks, computers used for our organizing work. They took the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, they took our book that had our finances in it. And their claim for why was because we had done a bake sale at the Anti-War Committee's yard sale, which is, of course, a big earner. Makes us real big terrorists. You know, from there, the 14 of us, we all pled the fifth. You know, at the time, that was a courageous step, you know, knowing that what we're doing is saying that we won't be part of this, that we won't actually be part of criminalizing the work that we have been doing or criminalizing the work that we have done in solidarity with people around the globe. You know, since then, they told us they'd put them on hold, these subpoenas for the 14 of us. Then in the day after elections, so they wait until all this, you know, kind of fake partisan shit is going on. I think all the kids are gone, so I can swear a little bit. You know, but they wait until the day after the elections, and they tell us that 3 people will have their subpoenas reactivated. Myself, Sarah Martin, and An Pham. And then in December, they subpoenaed 9 more people. All of the people in December that were subpoenaed are all out of Chicago. The majority of them were Arab and Muslim. All of those people got the date of January 25th to appear in front of the federal grand jury in Chicago, and they all also have pled the fifth courageously. You know, for the 3 of us that had our subpoenas reactivated, we all had to get our individual lawyers because it would be a conflict of interest, apparently, to organize like we do in our daily lives as activists. You know, and our lawyers even tried to do what we do, which is collectively bargain, collectively talk to the U.S. Attorney, and they wouldn't allow it. They said that absolutely we had to be treated, we had to have, each of our lawyers had to have individual meetings. And, you know, they were all intimidation tactics. If you don't talk, we're going to throw the book at you, you know, at your client, basically. We'd really like your client to come and sit in front of the FBI and talk to us. It's just a friendly meeting. I mean, I don't know if for those of you in Chicago probably heard from the person from CARE, these meetings are like, well, what do you think about the war? That makes you a criminal? That you dislike the war? Well, actually, that seems to be what they're trying to say to us now. You know, from here, and I think this is one of the things that's really confusing, you know, that was, so our lawyers had meetings in January. January 25th is when the last subpoena date happened. You know, but the problem is it's not exactly like a doctor's visit. No news doesn't mean good news. Like, it is not over for us, and it's, I think that's one of the things that's really hard, you know, it's hard to keep momentum going. But the reality is there continues to be FBI visits to people's homes in regards to our activity, you know, in regards to the people who are being subpoenaed. And they are all over the country, actually. There's no, you know, there's a good chance that more people will be subpoenaed. We're not an exclusive club. We love friends. Not that we would want anybody to join us, but it's, you know, it's obvious that they're trying to go after a community of activists and not individuals. We also, you know, there's also a really good chance of what Sarah talked about, that in fact they will offer us immunity, which I usually call it imposing immunity, because it's not like it's a fair deal. Oh, we won't charge you. We just want you to tell us, you know, all the people that you know. But if you don't talk when you are offered or imposed immunity, you go to jail for the life of the grand jury. Now, the grand jury is supposed to be an 18-month experience. Ours started in August of 2009. So in theory, that would be like February, right? But they can re-impanel themselves to go, so it's a total of 3 years. They get another 18 months. And they don't exactly give you a note saying, oh, by the way, we're still investigating you. We don't know that. We don't know if it's over. We don't know if it's continuing. We don't know if they're going to start a new one. We don't get notice. Yeah, I mean, and the reality is, well, what happens from a grand jury is indictments, federal charges. And we have all indications that they will pursue indictments against multiple people. Maybe 14, maybe 20, probably not 24, but who knows? They don't, you know, there aren't any charges, not a single charge. We don't know what case they're trying to make. There's a very good chance that they're talking about the Humanitarian Law versus Holder project. And, you know, some of us have done different levels of things. Maybe they're trying to criminalize all solidarity work with Palestine. That's not a world that I want to live in. And I think that that's one of the most important parts of this, is that standing up isn't a fun choice, you know? Like, this wasn't a fight that any of us chose, but it's the fight that we have in front of us. And I think the history is proven that, you know, despite government repression, the people can win. Sarah is a great example. Lutza is a great example. There are great examples in Egypt now and in Wisconsin. When people stand up and fight, that's how we win. And we don't win it individually, but we win it together. And I think I kind of want to end by just letting people know, if you haven't already seen, we've got plans for when the next shoe drops. And I hope that everyone in this room knows what those are. We're going to be at the Federal Building at 4:30, the day that subpoena dates are given again, the day that people are demanded to be in front of the grand jury, or the day that indictments happen, when we know and when we can, as quickly as we can mobilize you. We hope that all of you will commit to being there. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I want to comment on the prison system, because in this era, when the states are having such budget problems, if they would let the nonviolent prisoners out, most of those drug users, that would be a big help to the state budgets. And I just think this issue should be raised again, and again. And in California especially, when it would really help. But we know, of course, that we've got the prison guards that are protecting their turf. And
they're a powerful union.
Sorry,
they're a public union, but they made a lot of deals.
At one time here in Minnesota, not too many years ago, there was discussion of releasing some of the prisoners, and I went to some hearings at the state capitol, and there present were Freeman and judges and prosecutors, and I knew that proposal was going absolutely nowhere. But we can still
bring the issue up.
I think it's important. I mean, in California, there are 10 prisoners that they cost $2 million a year just to keep them chained to hospital beds. They're in vegetative states, and it's all basically salaries of they have to have 2 guards around the clock plus a supervisor at the hospital guarding these people in vegetative states that are handcuffed to their beds, and they have to go through parole hearings to be released, and they would really not be released. They just would not have the guards at their bed anymore. That's all. That would be the difference, you know. And now they're trying to push that through the legislature, and it's not the guards alone. The Republicans are incredibly nuts in California, and they won't do anything with prisoners.
Well, and then there's an organization called LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition,
right?
And that's parole officers and other law enforcement that sees the stupidity of keeping these prisoners, these nonviolent prisoners, in jail. And so they have an organization, a national organization, and actively work against the system that we've got. It is disgraceful. There's a new book out called The New Jim Crow about the imbalance with so many black people of color in the prisons and how that works. So I've ordered it, but I haven't gotten it.
It's great.
You read it?
Yeah.
I just have one little pitch too. As Tracy mentioned, the 3 people that have been re-subpoenaed, they have 3 different lawyers, and as we all know, lawyers don't come free. You know, you watch all the lawyer shows, and they kind of high-end, however good their intentions, and I'm sure they're good intentions for Tracy and I and Sarah, but it does cost money, so we're passing around a little bag here. Legal defense. Big bag. The legal defense fund, and I'd like to encourage you all by dropping some money in there, whatever you can think of, I'll pass it all down. Whichever way you want. Thank you very much. Check. What would
CSFR.
CSFR. Okay. We stop FBI repression.
Yeah, I just had a question for Jess or Tracy, and that is, given that it seems there's a strong possibility, or it's likely, or whatever, that indictments would take place, I'd be curious to hear what your view of what that would look like, what that means concretely, in terms of. And obviously, nobody can predict the future either, but I know that you have some sense of this.
So I got the nod from Tracy, so I'll give it a stab. But my understanding is that, well, we've all submitted letters to the prosecutor that if there are indictments, we would be willing to surrender to the authorities in Chicago. But they don't, it's sort of just an offer. It's an actual offer as opposed to an imposed letter of surrender. We've said we would surrender, but they don't have to honor that. They could knock at the door at 7 a.m. like they did when they came and raided our homes and just surprise us. Or they could call our attorneys and say you have 24 hours to report. You know, we don't have any way of knowing exactly how it will happen. And if and when it happens, our assumption, our guess is that we would probably be arrested, whether it's by surrender or by surprise, and have to put up bail and have to establish that we're not going to run away. And so we've all actually been working to collect letters from community leaders and friends, establishing our deep ties in the community, and I'm pretty slow at running, so that's probably until my letters. But also, like Tracy and I each talked to our parents about their houses and asking them to put up their houses to cover our bail. Other people talked to whoever they needed to talk to about such things. A lot of us have children. My partner and I were both subpoenaed, and we have a 6.5-year-old. And those of us with children have had to make arrangements for who would look after our children it's a reasonable guess, though it's certainly not within our control, that we would be able to bail out of jail and then wait for trial. And others probably know longer for me better than me about how long you get to wait between arrest and trial, but it seems like it can be quite a long time. And if people are convicted on any of these charges, the maximum penalty for one count of material support to foreign terrorist organizations is 15 years. There are many people who are serving 65 years. They get multiple counts, so like every time you made a phone call to Palestine, that's count 1, count 2, count 3, you know. I don't know how they would do this, but on the one hand, 15 years is the maximum penalty, but they could pursue more, and in other people's cases they have. And so, and that we know less about, but hopefully that answers your question.
Have you had other thoughts?
This political support and the community of resistance, in fact, is what helps me to not be, to feel like I'm not just in this. It's not just about me. Like, resisting the grand jury and refusing to cooperate is not necessarily in my own individual best interests. It could be or it could not be. I have no idea. But I know that it's in the best interest of the political movements and of the political community that I have committed my life to, and that is, I think, is what has to keep us together and keep us going. So I appreciated what you had to say about that.
Well, you always go out and vote, because if you vote one party in, then that's going to help everything. Whichever party it is, if the other one's not in. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest lies in the whole farce of lies is that it makes a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans.
I was out of the room for a little bit in the gym, so I don't totally understand if somebody already made this point. So if I did, you should just appreciate the fact that I think it's really important, as opposed to that I'm a bad listener. But I want to remind people that today is actually a national call-in day about the case. And so people here today were armed with some stories and some motivation. And so if you didn't call today, you could call tomorrow, because still a call is better than no call. And if you didn't have the phone numbers, you could go to stopfbi.net. But we'd really appreciate it if people could call the prosecutor, if people could call Holder and Obama. And it really piggybacks off of Polly Mann's case, which is that at the end of the day, this is going to be a political case. It's going to be decided how many resources are going to be put into this on the top levels of the Obama administration. Eric Holder or someone, in that echelon is going to make the decision about whether or not to impose immunity on people, whether or not to send people from our movement to jail. People, they're not, this is such a nationally talked about case. This is not a decision that is just going to be made by the Chicago office. Do you know what I'm saying? This is something that's going to be made, on the top levels of the DOJ. And so it's important for us to send a message that says, you're on notice, we're watching you. And what I think they want is with dragging out this whole, whether or not they give people immunity, whether or not they throw people in jail, whether or not they actually, press charges, is they're hoping that the anti-war movement goes, la, 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 we're focused on something else, or that, they want to decrease our momentum. And so I think it says a lot when people call for the 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th time to these people to be actually, I'm still calling because you still didn't do the thing I asked you to do the other 7 flippin' times I called. Which is that you haven't dropped the investigation and you haven't stopped, going after the anti-war and international solidarity movements, and you haven't started like actually looking at like the fact that there's real, there are real criminals in our society. They just unfortunately happen to work for the Obama administration. But but the fact is that like we aren't them. And so if people haven't called, I would really like to encourage people to do so. And if you did call already, you should give yourself a pat on the back.
Or ask somebody that you know who hasn't called.
Okay.
Or call again.
Or call, but I'm just saying, if you have called, I thank you very much.
This is a question for Jess. I know that, so this is a Freedom Road sponsored event tonight, and Freedom Road was one of the organizations that has been named in this witch hunt, and I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that relationship.
I was wondering if someone was going to ask that question. Certainly I know some of you, but many of you I haven't seen at a Freedom Road sponsored event before. I'm happy to see you here today. Our organization has, for a very long time, been dedicated to many people's struggles, including the anti-war movement, something that's very important to us. And we're also an organization that has really believed very strongly in building ties to people fighting for liberation in other countries. We have an identity of struggle. Their struggle is our struggle, and we have the same enemies too, the same opponents as well. And so there is I think a place for that's the first thing, is the Freedom Road's place in this is as a part of the anti-war movement and the international solidarity movement. All of the individuals who were subpoenaed who are also in Freedom Road are folks that have done some kind of work in our anti-war and international solidarity activism. That said, not all. I'm not very good with math. I don't even know if it's half the people that were subpoenaed, but a lot of the people who are subpoenaed aren't in Freedom Road. But the government's very interested in Freedom Road's role in our movements. I think the government would very much like to tell us who can and can't be in the anti-war movement, who's allowed to speak at the anti-war demonstrations, and who's allowed to march on the RNC with who. And I'm not just saying that like, I used to think I might have, this sort of thing sounded like paranoid conspiracies, and then the FBI came to my house, and I found out some woman I've been working in for 2.5 years was actually spying on me. My point is that the government, it's concrete, we understand. There have been some meetings with prosecutors where they have been very focused on Freedom Road. They're very unhappy with our politics, our ideas, and in fact they say that our work in solidarity with others is because we hope they will come save us from the enemies here. Like the Palestinians will, when they beat Israel, then they'll come help us beat Obama, and the Colombians too. And I know we could use a little help, but it's not really what we're up to. I have a long-range plan in my mind, and that wasn't the one I had. But the government has their own ideas about why we do the things we do and why we believe the things we believe. But Freedom Road is definitely something that's in their target. And I don't know, some of the people that they have been talking to are not very involved in anti-war activism and really know us through Freedom Road. And so certainly there's some special interest in our organization and our work in all of this. But they've also been investigating many organizations that are part of the people's movements, like the Anti-War Committee, the Palestine Solidarity Group in Chicago, and of course many of us are in other groups like SDS and WHAM, which weren't necessarily named in the search warrants, but that's who we are. So, and certainly our spy loved to get to know everybody. She did a lot of, she was had infiltrated the Anti-War Committee for 2.5 years, and after somewhere in there joined Freedom Road as well. And she always wanted to run around and go to the coalition meetings. She went to all of them, which was very helpful, because there's more meetings, and how many meetings can all the people with little children go to? I'm just saying, it was a helpful thing, it seemed like. But it wasn't a helpful thing, because she was really using us to spy on other organizations too. And so Freedom Road's place in this is we're definitely very mixed up in it. It's not clear yet how far the government's going to take that, but I believe that it is likely that if there are indictments or when the government goes public with some of their criticisms of us or charges against us, that you will hear not only that we're bad terrorist lovers, but we're bad communist terrorist lovers. Just like Glenn Beck says, if you watch Fox News, which hopefully you don't, but if you happen to on accident, he was talking about us all this week, and well, on the 3rd. He did a big spot on it, and it was 12 and a half minutes. Somebody's like, oh, you're on Glenn Beck, and I thought it'd be like 5 seconds of a 15-minute thing, but it was the whole thing. I got our website up there, the Fight Back website, the CSFR website, my pretty picture. Anyway, we can't read minds, we can't read the future, but I know that the prosecutor has a lot of problems with Freedom Road. I know that the spy spent plenty of time trying to get to know people in Freedom Road. And I know Glenn Beck hates us too. So you'll probably hear more about our place in all of this as things unfold.
I hate Glenn Beck.
I know.
Well, he says the enemy of your enemies is not your friend. I maybe disagree with him, but personally, but that's what he says. So if you hate him and therefore disagree with him, then there you go. I'm his enemy, I think. I don't know. Sorry, I'm rambling.
Yeah, right. Nobody can ramble.
I'll use this as a quick opportunity to make a pitch. For all of you who haven't heard about the Glenn Beck piece, you should go to the Fight Back website. Like Fight Back News just did a piece on it, and there's sign-up sheets in the back. It's also a great place to hear about the national organizing that's been going on around our case, and Madison, and all types of people's struggles that are happening. It's one of my favorite news sources when reading about the people's struggles and learning about people's struggles in other areas, because I'm from Minnesota and I barely leave the place until I get subpoenaed, and then I go all over the place. But I think it's a really important news source, and people should think about helping to contribute to make it a better news source too.